What's up, everybody? Welcome back to episode 5 of AI Mavens. Dave, what's going on in your life this week?
Snow. There's some snow going on in my life outside right now. Luckily, I'm inside and not impacted by it. How about you, Peter?
Same here. Snow, melt, ice, back to snow, whatever. It's all good. That's what you
Winter in
get from
Canada.
living
Hmm.
close to the Rocky Mountains, I guess. It all
Hmm.
has its ups and downs. But I actually enjoyed the winter wonderland landscape the last week or so. It's been nice, and I suspect it's the same for you.
Yeah, it's something incredibly peaceful about fresh snow. It does clean up outside quite lovely, and there's just this quiet that happens when there's snow.
Yeah,
When you're driving around or walking around, it's quite lovely.
yeah. It covers up all the brown grass, which I really
Hmm.
enjoy. Yeah, for sure. Fantastic. Well, we have a whole slew of interesting AI news this week, and maybe I will let you get started with what's going on in AI.
For sure. Yeah. So this one is DeepMind is Google's AI lab, essentially internal. And what they've done is they've kind of imagined all the different areas that AI can impact and how that can have kind of an immense change and difference in the world. Because it's kind of fascinating. They make this point that if you scroll up, there's about 5 areas they're going to talk about. But I don't know if you've ever read like a scientific article that gets published.
Hmm.
It's dense, complicated text, really only makes sense to scientists.
Right.
And one of the things that's interesting is AI is really good at reading through dense, complicated language and giving you summaries of it. What you really wish is that someone would take these super complicated, scientific, nerdy articles and kind of make them make sense to you, which is exactly what AI is good with,
Hmm.
good at. So what they're saying is in these 5 areas, that there's going to be revolutionary change because AI can look at knowledge, at data, and all these different areas and make a dramatic impact and change about the future, which I think is really interesting. Peter, have you ever read through like a scientific article and stuff like that?
I have, especially in the medical space, where I've been
Yeah.
doing lots of work over the last 10 years or so in different medical technology startups. Yeah, it is challenging for sure. But
Mhm.
what are the major takeaways you've gathered from this?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting is our ability to process this information is really new and innovative. And some of these things that will be like synthetic materials, drugs, like a harder titanium or a more effective diabetes drug. These are things that would take us years and years to imagine. That we can sort of throw these models at and see what they can come up with, and they can evaluate the efficacy of it so they can imagine it, test it out, and validate it in ways that we were never able to before. So I think that's just going to give us a pace of change that we're really unfamiliar with and don't know how to adapt to.
So it's basically, if I get it right, it's the way a way of using the agentic approach to scientific research,
Yeah,
having
exactly.
different agents that work through the process of what good science is, essentially.
Precisely. And they've sort of like looked at this and said, what is likely to change out of this?
Mm-hmm.
Like, where is that process, that kind of agentic approach, going to have the most dramatic impact?
Mm-hmm.
And so they've called out these 5 areas, like the data sets that you and I can hold in our minds and really kind of think through and kind of ruminate on
Mm-hmm.
are fairly small relative to what these AI tools can hold in memory, if you will,
Yes,
and parse
absolutely.
through.
Yeah, yeah. Which is one of the biggest strengths, I think, of that approach, is that it's a much broader view on the entire data set of any expertise, right? So then
Precisely.
that's the models and in the end the solutions. So that's really interesting. So have they given any good examples of what they're going to apply to? Have you seen anything like that?
Yeah, like the idea of like hurricanes and floods. Our weather is changing so dramatically
Mm-hmm.
that we can't imagine what it's like, and we can't forecast what that's going to look like.
Right,
And weather forecasting is notoriously and hilariously wrong all the time. When they get that right, who knows? But
for
I'll be
sure.
curious to see.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic. And then, of course, in other news, we have learned that Fei Li brought her new startup out of stealth mode. She gave a longer presentation and a talk on YouTube a while ago when she was still kind of in stealth mode with what they're actually doing. But it's interesting that she's used to be focused on ImageNet, which is basically her prediction was basically over 10 years ago that computers will be eventually able to understand images. And now she's applying the same approach to entire worlds, Dave. What's that all about?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating project that she's been working on and well-funded. Fei Li is famous for 20 years ago, basically doing, as you said, starting ImageNet, working on that. Geoffrey Hinton just won the Nobel Prize for some of his work around this Fei Li ran a contest every year to say,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
how effective can you get at recognizing images? And Geoffrey Hinton won that and blew everybody out of the water with this kind of neural net model that he put together.
Right.
And so in that became famous and has had a lot of recognition, but it's on the back of the hard research work that Fei Li did. And so I think she's really interesting because she's an innovator in the space, probably hasn't had enough recognition for all the good work she's done. And she's always been curious about how we see the world and
Right.
kind of what we quote unquote see through computers.
Right.
And so what she's done here is tried to map out more of obviously the input image is that one on the left. And
Right.
this 3D world that they're able to create, kind of imagining all the space around it, is such a fascinating jump from a still image or a drawn image.
I was
And
just
so they're
gonna.
generating. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, is that the claim that this entire world that is navigated through in 3D on the right is entirely generated just by this one input image?
That's essentially what they're aiming for. Whether
Right.
they are there yet or whether
Okay.
they are in process of that, that is the goal of this startup, essentially.
I
So
see.
I don't think it's clear that they've sort of nailed it. They've got one image that you can then immediately jump into a 3D world,
Right.
but that's where they're moving.
Right. Right. Fantastic. And I the way I understood her talk recently is that it's not just about generating images in 3D or worlds in 3D, but really understand all the items that exist in that world and their purpose and their place in that space, so to speak, right? Like understanding the worlds. So in many ways, it kind of goes along with what Elon Musk is trying to do with what he calls real world AI, that that an AI that understands the world around you, so you can use it to interact with that physical world, like robotic applications with humanoid robots or with machine robots in factories, or as well as, of course, cars in the real world, right? It's all a similar application. So I wonder how much overlap there is between those two approaches. This seems to be much more like, at the moment, geared towards dream worlds or hyper photorealistic applications, maybe Hollywood type stuff. But if they truly understand what's going on in these worlds in terms of the physical properties of the elements in the world, then there might be quite a bit of overlap.
Yeah, one thing you'll notice about all these images we're seeing right here is that there's motion, but there's still. So there's no people moving around in those images.
Right.
There's no cars driving by. There's no dogs running out, things like that.
Right.
And you mentioned Elon Musk and the problem he's trying to solve, which is way more complicated. As I always tell my kids, driving is easy if you're the only person on the road. Navigating a car is not that complicated. It's the other drivers and people walking across the road and cyclists and all the different elements that make it complicated.
Garbage cans
human
that fall
beings are complex.
over or whatever in front of you.
Exactly. All those things that kind of are the random elements in the world. And that's the problem that Elon Musk is trying to solve a little bit,
Right.
is how do you navigate through that complicated real world scenario? So I'm curious to see when Fei Li and kind of her project here brings in that motion of not just moving through a world, but having a moving world that you move through, if that makes sense.
Right. And is there any hint on, like, can people get in there and try to dabble with those tools, or is that still in the future?
For right now, it looks like it's just kind of talking about the idea that it's not something that is that you and I can jump into, but she's announcing that it is possible out of that.
Right. Fantastic. Good to hear. Good. Then we have another news item, and I'll let you introduce it, Dave.
For sure. And this one is the idea that we're all familiar with NVIDIA and its dominance in the chip market. But this is a really interesting one because Jeff Bezos and Samsung have just invested $700 million in a TENS torrent company, which is a Canadian company. So as a fellow Canadian, I love that idea that there are challengers to NVIDIA's dominance. And I'm really interested to kind of see where this goes because they've got a fairly good presence so far in terms of the chip market, and just more competition in that space makes a lot of sense because right now the growth of the AI industry is pretty much limited by what NVIDIA can produce.
Right.
Everything they can make for the next 5 years is probably purchased. So for that industry to increase, someone's got to be doing something different, and I love that there's a Canadian company entering into that space.
Yeah. That's fantastic. There's some advertising in the article here, but that's really good news to hear. And I guess seeing that Jeff Bezos is confident to invest, as well as Samsung. Samsung had some interesting news in the headlines lately about their corporate challenges, but nonetheless they're investing in the future, which is interesting for sure. In the same token, I found it quite interesting comparing how different countries approach the changes that are here and coming in the next years, of course, through this technology. And I find it really sadly, it's not amusing, but definitely entertaining and interesting. How, for instance, the big gap between Japan and Germany, for instance, my home country. So Germany is recently in the news with really declining numbers in the automotive industry, which is essentially the major industry in Germany, exporting into the world, and in the last couple of decades into China, and having lots of success and stability and growth. But now that has changed. China is making their own EVs at prices that nobody can compete with, partly probably subsidized by the government in China. But also Germany has slept on its laurels in terms of innovation and engineering. And so they're paying the price right now in rapidly declining business, essentially. Volkswagen is in the news with all the protests and the unions fighting essentially the closure of factories in Germany, etc. In comparison, Japan has been going through a rough period over the last, I don't know, 15 years maybe, with the stagflation that came out of the 2008 financial crisis, I believe. And they now have announced that the government is investing $70 billion in chip factories, in basically creating microprocessor chips. Of course, responding to the new push in terms of needs for microchips, right? And of obviously the crisis, or the looming crisis with China and Taiwan. So, not wanting to go into geopolitics, but how countries and companies in those countries respond is really interesting. On one side you see Germany complaining and hand waving, not having any plans, and then you see Japan, that has been in crisis for a while, at least putting a foot forward and saying, this is our path, and we decide to go with that, and we'll see how it turns out, but we have to do something, right?
Yeah, it's a great idea and push. I think my read is that it's chip manufacturing seems very complicated. And a lot of people in the US are also saying, hey, we should do chip manufacturing.
Right.
I think it's a little more complicated than that. So the $70 billion investment makes sense in terms of how they're going to tackle this problem and step into that space.
Right.
But all the way, like the companies that are doing this really well, like NVIDIA, have locked up all the natural resources and the whole supply chain of partnering with people who manufacture all the elements along with it.
Right.
And Jensen spent the last 40 years building software, hardware, supply chain,
optimizing that whole process. Yeah.
All the way through. So I think to compete with that, you have to fully understand the engine that he's built around NVIDIA, and why it has such a moat around it, because it's quite impressive. And I think to just kind of bully your way into that market is probably not going to be that easy.
Right.
You have to be smart and strategic about it to win, which Japan may very well be doing. But I'm curious to see all the people that want to jump on this bandwagon, how effective they'll be.
Yeah. And I don't understand enough of the numbers. If you go back and compare that to the automotive industry, China has basically brute forced its way into the automotive industry, right? In the last 10 years or 15 years. And the switch or the trend towards EVs or hybrids has basically helped them a little bit along the way, because there's basically a paradigm shift in the technology. Mm-hmm. I can't judge whether $60-70 billion is a lot or a little towards that goal. I really can't. If you look at it from comparing it to NVIDIA's business, it's kind of in the middle of the road, right? Like that. Does that investment make a dent? I guess is the question in my head. If you execute well with that money in your back.
It's a great question. So I think as you say, back in the 70s when gas prices got high and Americans wanted to drive different types of cars, not the big ones, the smaller ones, Japan really hit the market at the right time with that, of producing smaller, more efficient and effective vehicles, and really boosted their economy quite significantly.
Right.
Is this a similar moment in terms of chip design? Are they making the right investment to the right moment in time?
Right.
Great. I think we'll know in a couple of years.
Yes.
Really hard to figure out if, from what we can see today, if that's the right move executed at the right pace.
For sure. And with that, let's jump into our deep dive for today. So we came across a presentation of Benedict Evans, which is titled "AI Eats the World." Dave, let me know what that's all about, because you have been following Benedict Evans for quite a while now, right?
Yeah, so Benedict Evans, Ben has spent the last 20 years analyzing mobile media and technology. He basically has built himself a career writing essays, which I love. Just in that. So he gives presentations to all the Fortune 100 companies and does some really interesting presentations here. And so every year he'll release some information. You can see all of his presentations on his website. But he also has a newsletter that I follow, and it's a great thing to get into if you don't already, because he talks about things that are really relevant to AI and business, and just random things that are interesting as well. So he has this whole kind of articulated section around stuff that he just finds interesting in the world. And then he talks about data. He has different sections. I find it really informative and take some time every week to make sure I read through it. It's a great presentation, or a great newsletter. This presentation is sort of his thoughts about where AI is going and where, from what we can see today, what might be next. And he's got some great quotes all the way through. He's talking about Bill Gates says, "In my lifetime, I've seen two demos of tech that struck me as revolutionary: the graphical user interface, or the GUI, and ChatGPT." So like Windows is this idea that you're building a graphical user interface. So Bill Gates, his entire ecosystem of the graphical user interface, and ChatGPT, those two things he's holding up as equivalent, which is interesting.
Interesting point, though, because if I might challenge him a little bit on that, or you, or everybody. Do you remember how hard it was Microsoft to be wrestled into implementing a GUI in Windows? What was the version? I think 3.11 was the first version that was kind of acceptable or workable.
3.1 was kind of that early. It was not good. At the time, it was revolutionary.
It was kind of working, yeah. And so it seemed like, okay, maybe it was just a really complex task by keeping all that backwards compatibility to DOS and whatever was before going. And but it seemed to me if Apple would have made that claim, I would have maybe believed that inspiration a little bit more, because there was the discussion at the beginning is like, okay, well, a GUI is just going to slow you down. It's better if you keep a command line going, kind of thing. But anyways, that's old news. Here we are, and I'm sure he is truthful here in saying that ChatGPT or these LLMs at this level of capability are one of the two demonstrations that of tech that's struck him as revolutionary. So interesting approach.
It's an interesting comparison, though, because as you say, Windows 3.1 was revolutionary and pretty clumsy and not that good.
Exactly.
And ChatGPT is revolutionary, but is it clumsy and not that good? Like, it's not refined to the way, like the GUI and the modern OS that we use today on our phones, on our laptops and stuff, is so much more refined than what we had in Windows 3.1.
Yeah.
And
years of
this
debugging, years of debugging, yes.
And use and innovation and change. So is ChatGPT in its current format the Windows 3.1, essentially? Is that what we're getting?
Exactly. So we just, in our preparation for today's show, we talked about the fact that a lot of people we talk to look at these tools that we maybe mention to people or try to introduce them to, or even just hear back what they've been experiencing, and they're saying, well, it's kind of cool, but it breaks here and it doesn't do that, and it can't do coding properly yet, and so on. And I'm like, yeah, it's true. Yeah, it is exactly that clumsy first version of Windows, 3.1 or whatever it was, 3.1, 3.11, but then, of course, a rapid growth or development curve ensued from there, and we got to where we are today over a long period, yes, but we got a lot of useful products out of that. And I think the wave that is coming in terms of development and improvements and refinement is at least similar, if not much more rapid. What's your view on that, Dave?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the next slide, it talks about the fact that it took Microsoft 20 years to hit $150 billion valuation, and
Right.
OpenAI is there within a year. So the pace of change and the fact of what you're talking about, people don't have a lot of patience for the fact that these tools aren't refined yet.
Right.
We've had 20 years of refinement or 30 years of refinement in our desktop software. 15 to 20 years of refinement in our mobile technology software. And so when something like this lands and it's a text input, like DOS, essentially, where we ask it for a prompt and it gives us a response, we're immediately thinking, why is this not as refined as my mobile phone?
Right.
And so the pressure on OpenAI and Sam Altman in this is to figure out how to jump across that chasm and get that next version that works for us.
Mm-hmm.
But it takes us the clumsy stumbling through to get to where we want to go. And there's no tolerance for that. It's not perfect, so it's not useful as sort of this human reaction we get.
Right.
And I think that in that gap is a really interesting opportunity.
Right. And I think that is sort of interestingly connects to the whole conversation of OpenAI coming out with ChatGPT 2, 3, and 4, with the claim that they want to build a safe system by introducing it early into society and allowing society to learn, as these things are still not a major threat to society from a safety point of view, and then for regulators to be able to jump in and maybe put some limits on where it's really potentially dangerous. But I think there's the other aspect, which is probably just as important, if not more. I mean, we need safety for sure, but which is the moment you put a product out in the world, it starts to change. It starts to change by the feedback you get from the users. What do they actually want to do with this, which is often quite different than what you expect. And it also starts to change the users. I'm sure if you would take a modern, highly refined iPhone 16 and put it in front of a BlackBerry users of 15 years ago, they probably would struggle a little bit, because they haven't been going through this mental adaptation process of what a all screen, no keyboard, user interaction system looks like. So I think it's always goes both ways, and in this case, it's definitely changing people's behavior, right? Like our children, they're growing up now. My son is just learning to talk at 2 and 3 years old, and obviously he will always be used to the fact that a computer can be talked to and talks back to you. It's completely normal to him, right? It's probably going to be potentially going to be the first interaction he has with a proper computer or a computer system, and also maybe the predominant way of interaction, at least in a non-work environment.
Yeah, someone I was talking with recently said that their young child was asking YouTube. They were on their phone and suddenly had videos of Peppa Pig. She's like, she can't type. Like, what's happening here? And they
Right.
saw the microphone icon, somehow figured out how to talk to YouTube and ask for Peppa Pig. And boy, what a feedback loop that is
Yeah,
for a toddler
for
to get
sure.
that. So
Fantastic.
the idea you can ask a parent something and ask a device something is sort of an expectation in young kids' lives right now, which is
Right.
fascinating.
Yeah, and in my case, or in some cases, the machine might actually have more intelligible answers than the parent.
Ask ChatGPT for your homework help.
Yeah, exactly. All right, next slide. What's going on here? Huge interest.
This is
ChatGPT researched mainstream consciousness with unprecedented speed.
I'd be curious to see like the equivalent graph of this for the internet, let's say, because I think the internet started in North America and kind of moved across. It was in pockets and stuff like that. The idea that this isn't just a U.S. phenomenon or a German phenomenon or a Japanese phenomenon.
Right.
You look across all these different geographic areas,
Right.
and it's like 60% of people, more than half of people everywhere have heard of it, and a majority of people, 30%, have used it. So it's an interesting, becoming mainstream across the globe in an interesting way. The growth and pace of that is really fascinating to me in this.
Okay, that's for sure. And I think we had a similar experience with the state of small business slides we looked at in the last episode. So, there's a lot of consciousness and awareness already of at least the existence of the tools and some experience in using them as well. So, and that in a pace we haven't seen before. That's certainly indicative of the fact that this is it's not a fad that we're looking at here, for sure. I mean, I think that discussion is over for a while now. Let's look at the next slide. So here we have some information on the interest, and that's in juxtaposition to some limited use so far. What is this all about?
Yeah, this gets interesting. It's made a splash, but what's its sticking or staying power is kind of the point of this slide, where it's taken that next view and said that red line at the bottom is daily use. The pink is weekly, and kind of the gray is used once or twice, which I think is almost the majority of people around here.
Right.
It's very infrequent to see that people are using it daily across all these others, but maybe a little more in US and Argentina, which is interesting. But that dynamic. Peter, how often do you use ChatGPT? Is it daily, weekly, or monthly?
It depends on the week, to be honest. There's been weeks where I haven't used it for days. But then there is weeks where I use it multiple times a day, and sometimes for longer periods. So it depends on what I'm doing. If I'm doing research and planning, I use it a lot. If I'm doing, writing out my thought process or instructions or marketing material or whatever it is, then I use it quite frequently. Even in my email communication, I sometimes consult it to optimize a little bit of what I'm trying to express, especially when it's across multiple languages. But then if there's things like working on a product or on thinking through a business process, optimizing, team related dynamics or such things, then it's a little bit less. So how about yourself? How do you find yourself using these tools on a daily basis?
Yeah, I'm starting to, again, I think whenever you can run experiments and tinker with it, through conversation and through experimentation, the thing I'm starting to get to is I use ChatGPT almost daily, like not quite daily, but close. I'm similar
Right.
to you, where I have bursts and kind of cadences around that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm starting to use Claude by Anthropic a little more for writing, because I find that with prompting, I get better output out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I'm sitting down to do some research and explore a new topic, I'll typically dive into Perplexity for that, because I like the convenience of that. But ChatGPT is on my phone and on my desktop, and I love that I can grab my phone, ask a few questions in the conversational mode. If you pay for the ChatGPT service, you get a really quick, low latency, real time verbal response. So if I'm driving or brushing my teeth, sometimes I'll have it talk back to me, or like making dinner or something like that.
Hmm.
And then I know all of those answers are on my desktop when I come back to copy and paste or borrow from that. I
Right.
find that really useful.
That is very useful for sure. I find it interesting also. What has changed my or our behavior is at the dinner table. So what has happened is that, at the dinner table you have a conversation about some topic. It may be nutrition or economics or fitness, exercise, or some other thing. Can be about technology, can be about often about popular culture, actually, music, whatever it is that's going on with our children and so on, and their lives. And when they ask questions, you think about it and you're like, okay, well, I don't quite have the answers to this. And while we used to Google this in the past, I find the barrier for me mentally to now not Google it and then find the right page to answer what I'm looking for, like the right source, essentially. I just asked ChatGPT in conversational mode and have a short conversation with ChatGPT in front and with everybody on the around the table. And I think, and that gets to mostly the true answer really quickly. Of course, if it's something mission critical or health critical or whatever, you always want to double check and compare. But that's something that's changed in our behavior already, and I really enjoy that because it crosses another barrier of mental resistance to actually do the research and understand the full answer to something. And we often get deeper into topics because of it.
It's great modeling too of just like how to research, how to learn. The fascinating one that happens in my house all the time is, can we feed this to our dog? There's some scrap or that thing that's fallen to the ground. My dog's really good about pausing and waiting. And so
Right.
we want to quickly figure out, can the dog eat that, or will it be harmful to it? A grape? No. Cucumber? Yes. And so it's interesting that there's such strange rules around what will be helpful or harmful to a dog.
Right.
That kind of information is interesting little tidbits to pull in.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's interesting in terms of limited use. So, do you see a dynamic in terms of that use changing? Is there any indication what growth rates in use we see? Because obviously, it's not been in the grand picture of things, it's not been a very long time since these tools have become really usable. Let's say.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see like what the trend is around this. Like what will cause all of those pink, dark gray, and light gray lines to go
Right.
red, if I can
Right.
use
Right.
that. Like what will cause people to make this a daily use tool for
Right.
them?
Right. What's the
Like you
killer
and I
app
giving
for
examples.
people? Yeah. Right.
Exactly. What causes that behavior change?
Right.
They've made this splash. They've gotten lots of recognition. What UI or GUI change? The Windows 95 or like the 3.11 to Windows 95. What is the moment that kind of is that big shift? Voice was what they kind of predicted around that, and I'm curious to see if that's the thing.
Yeah, nice segue into the next slide that we've picked is slide number 9 here. So, what's beyond the noise? The next platform shift. It's not exactly in terms of the end user application, but in terms of the platforms themselves. So we start with the mainframes all the way to the left that basically introduced computing into the business world way back when, and then we had PCs and networks and SQL databases. Then we introduced the web was introduced and open source software, and then eventually smartphones and mobile computing around 2007-ish, with the launch of the first iPhone, where it became a mainstream popular thing to do mobile computing in that style. And now, obviously, we see generative AI being the next major platform shift. I think that's an established fact by now. Would you say?
Yeah, like I think the idea that you can quickly put an image together or have it draft an email for you, or take your email and I know a lot of people who say, make this email sound friendly because I wrote it when I was mad. I want it to sound friendly. How do I do that? Or make it sound more serious? Whatever your intent or tone is, you've got your core messaging across. You take some bullet points and have it expand out. I think everyone's had that experience enough that that's not an experimental thing. It's something
Hmm.
that people are using in their day-to-day work. And I think as that starts to roll out more, and we get that built into Microsoft Word in the way they're embedding it, and into more of our tools. Apple's just released Apple Intelligence, and
Right.
Android has that released. So it's in your phone, in your pocket, all with you all the time. As people get to use that a little bit more, I'll be curious to see how that curve kind of moves up into the right.
Yeah, and again, next slide is exactly looking at that. But everything is wide open. We don't know the answers. We are still working out the questions. So here is three interesting questions are brought up on this slide, Dave. What are they?
Yeah, like everyone's trying to imagine how everyone wants to know from a finance perspective how many more chips will Nvidia sell. No one knows. And then how is this useful? How will it kind of embed into our lives? Is it in our phones? Is it in our laptops? Is that conversational? These are open questions. And
Right,
then how do we deploy this? How do we take this in the enterprise context and make it real for people? I think there's a bunch of open questions here.
right.
We see some emerging answers, but there's not certainty in it.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny when we look at this first red circle with the first question here on this slide, how far will this scale? It reminds me of this investor conversation that said basically Nvidia is currently the engine that converts all startup investments into chips. So the best investment you can probably make, and this is not investment advice by any means, but it was an interesting, I don't know if you can see it as a joke or if a reality is actually just to invest in Nvidia and you take advantage of all the startup investments in the world. So certainly an interesting dynamic, and will be really an interesting study later, 2-3 years down the road, whether this continues to scale in terms of the market growth and whether it's sustainable. So we talked last episode in episode 4 about all of the growth expectations from the frontier model companies, Google, Anthropic, and of course OpenAI, and Amazon is and XAI are joining that arena, and or have joined already, and that's interesting to see whether that growth expectation in terms of the models, the training compute, and so on is going to be sustainable. How is it useful, and how do we deploy this? I think that's where maybe in one of the future episodes we want to go into a deeper dive, which is this going to be a top-down or a bottom-up approach in terms of how the market is adopting it? Is it the top-down where enterprise applications are implemented that are highly productive, substituting or maybe augmenting labor and making corporations and companies and supply chains much more effective? Or is it going to be a bottom-up approach where people individually or in small groups, in startups, etc., figure out new use cases that are going to be so much different and better than old school work, essentially? So I think that's going to be a longer and deeper topic, but it's all around these questions, isn't it?
It's a great question. I wish if I had the answer to that. Boy, that'd be fantastic. Later in the slides, Ben calls out that Accenture has like this hockey stick growth in terms of its AI projects.
Right.
But then he steps in to look at the idea that all of it is prototypes, proof of concepts, and all the CIOs for those organizations have no plans for what they're going to do in the next year, essentially. So everyone's playing with it, tinkering with it, but is it anything that's actually going to become something? How do we deploy this is an open question for sure.
Right. Why is he looking here at 2013 in this slide number 38?
Yeah, so this is like basically AI is not new. It's not something that's just sort of landed. In 2013, this is Fei-Fei Li's work around image recognition. This is the moment that Geoffrey Hinton sort of built that neural network model, and they could figure out that there was pattern recognition, and that there was this kind of amazing leap forward. And again, that's 11 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we're seeing some of the benefits around that, and it's kind of become real in our lives. So this red circle of like, we've got this pattern recognition, we figured this thing out, everyone assumed
Right.
this was a big unlock. but it wasn't really, didn't actually do that much. So now, what can we turn into pattern recognition like this? Like we figured out images. What do we actually have now with this? I think is the open question that he's asking there. That in
Right.
2024, in its current moment and leading into 2025, what pattern can we figure out?
Right. So then there is another slide, in slide number 41, where essentially he's talking about the error awareness is still limited, and the apparent fluency of text output conceals the nature of the model behind them. I think this is pointing towards some of the hallucination aspects that we've seen so far, with a lot of the models being highly confident about the errors they make. Okay, so if we look at the column here on the left, we say, aware of Gen AI, use Gen AI, aware of Gen AI on the right, and then again, use Gen AI. These are comparisons based on those who agree that generative AI always produces factually accurate answers. And then those who agreed, go ahead.
So there's two columns here. On the left, those two are talking about, is it accurate? Is it giving the right answer?
Right.
And it's historical of last year and this year. And the first column is those who are aware of Gen AI. You've heard of it, but you haven't used it. What do you think? And then the right is people who have used Gen AI. So you can see the delta there grows on those first two columns on the left. When you ask someone, does AI generate factually accurate answers? Does it tell you the truth? Does it hallucinate, essentially? And those people who have used it are like, no, it doesn't. And even less so in 2024. So it's declined.
Yeah.
But the interesting one is the unbiased. So people who are aware of Gen AI, you ask, is what it produces, generative AI, is it unbiased? Those who are aware of it haven't changed in their answer. And 25% of them say, yeah, of course it's unbiased. And those who have used it, there's a little bit of a delta, but not as much as you might think, which is really fascinating to me. So this is the idea that there is hallucination, that it's a current problem to manage and we have to figure it out. For anyone that's deep in the industry, understands and is aware of this.
Right.
And what this is pointing to is the general public. What are their perceptions? It's very limited to people understand the complexity of getting the right answer.
Yeah, for sure. And Geoffrey Hinton recently gave a talk after he received the Nobel Prize. And he made an interesting point to me, which was that, yes, the current LLMs hallucinate. While they have a vast amount of knowledge available at your fingertips, essentially much more than any human could ever hold at the same time, they do hallucinate, of course, about facts, especially if it's a topic that they maybe don't have enough training data on, or not conclusive enough training data on. But they said humans do that all the time. As well. And he said, I think he made a sort of a recursive joke there where he said basically, I just made that up, but I believe it's true. So,
yeah, like what person do you ask a question of that you fully believe their answers, right? Like I guess maybe anytime you're asking someone a question, you have to take that with a grain of salt. They say, like, you have to kind of have that perspective. For some reason, there's this cognitive dissonance when we ask a computer a question.
Right.
We expect it to be fully accurate, where even in Google search, we've learned that we have to search to find the right answer for us. And you have to evaluate the trustworthiness of whatever that piece of web information is on the internet, because we know it's not always right. But if Gen AI has been trained on the internet, all the good and bad that's out there, why do we expect it's correct? It's a really fascinating thing.
I think that gives me that inspires an interesting thought from me, which is, I think we have two things that are working against each other at the moment. We as humans come from a place where we expect computers to be like they used to be in the past, which is deterministic. I remember when Intel announced, I don't know, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, that they had a flaw in their chip, and they basically had to issue a type of firmware update. So to basically omit a calculation error that the chip was doing at a very low level on a sort of on a binary level, and the world was shocked. It's like, how can they release a processor and expect me to use it that has an error in its calculation, and now we have to have this software that circumvents it and makes the chip slower, and I paid all this money for it. I remember it was a big deal in the public. Must have been 20 years ago or something like that, but it was a big deal. So we expected computers to be deterministic, and they were. You put the same input in, you always get the same output, otherwise they're broken, essentially, as a system, right? Humans don't work like this. However, now we have these probabilistic systems that essentially, based on statistical math, essentially find what's probably the right answer based on a set of inputs and the training data provided prior to that. But here's the last factor that makes it really interesting, which is a system like ChatGPT, an LLM chat system, always gives one answer to every question you give it, or it gives you a list of bullets that it determines to be, maybe a list of things that are relevant to the answer. But it essentially gives you one answer, versus Google gives you a list of sources, and it doesn't ever claim that any of them is right. So you basically go through and you look at the source and whether you think it's trustworthy and how well it's presented and how complete the answers are. And then you make up your own mind, because essentially this content is generated by humans, or was at least generated by humans. But now you go into a system where the computer answers. So the first idea is it's a computer, so it must do things right, because it's a perfect calculator, so to speak. Backwards old school thinking. And it gives me one answer that it picked as the right answer. And it's very confident about it in its language, how it presents that answer as well. I think those three factors combined lead to sort of us being surprised if it's wrong. Versus when we talk to a human being, we're not surprised if they're wrong. And often, a lot of things go into the world of opinions, of course.
Yeah, it's for those that used Google historically, you'll remember they used to have a button called "I'm feeling lucky."
Yeah.
You'd type back in the day. You'd type in your search term or your search phrase,
right,
and you'd hit search. But they eventually, when they got confident, they had this button that said "I'm feeling lucky," and when you pressed that, it took you to the first search result. So instead of seeing the results page and choosing, you would just go directly to whatever it thought you were trying to find. Which is this interesting moment, but they framed it in a way where they weren't saying, we know what you're looking for, we're going to take you there. It was this element of chance. And I think that's this moment we're in with generative AI, and all those things you just described, Peter, kind of relate to that. But it's also that, as you say, we want computers to have human level intelligence. And we have different expectations of what that looks like in a computer than we would between the two of us.
Right, for sure. Yeah. So I think those three factors really it's a psychological game, how we perceive these tools and where they come from and where they are today, and the nature of the presentation of it being one answer that's confidently delivered. And even in politics and other areas of life, we listen to someone that confidently delivers a message that's complete nonsense, and lots of people might buy into it, right? And then others, maybe not so confident in their delivery, have done better homework or are more based on facts, and we might not buy into it. So I think that the delivery is always very important as well. Next slide. So basically on slide 45, we're looking at what are these tools giving us in basically one headline. I find that quite interesting that there's nothing else on the screen of this slide, Dave.
This is a super boring slide with just 5 words. But I think this is the most impactful slide in the whole 90-slide deck. Because I think this is the thing that artificial intelligence today enables for us that we're not ready for yet.
Right.
That AI gives you infinite interns. So like the idea that we're all waiting for AI to replace our work. When can I send an AI agent to do my job instead of me going into work in the morning? Like that's the sort of the moment we're waiting for. But I think if we can figure out how to change our work streams, which is super complicated and very kind of deeply personal, the idea that to draft a letter, to generate some research, to ask someone to do a task, if you can apply AI really well through different modes, that's a huge level up in opportunity. Like this is the moment we're in, and the what is it for? To me, it's this. This is the answer.
And it sounds initially like, sort of the gift from heaven, like have infinite interns. But if you look at interns, they also, if you want them to become productive, they need a lot of care, right? They need a lot of TLC in terms of, get them into the system, make them understand how you work, help them to grow within an organization, give them essentially that training to be able to be effective within a certain specific vertical of expertise. And then they get hungry at lunchtime. So what does that mean in terms of the pros and the cons from your perspective?
Yeah, like it sounds magical, right? To have infinite interns. But the practicality of that, if you had 50 interns in your office all bumbling around, having no idea what to do, and you had to coach and give them all context and then evaluate their work, that's actually a huge headache. It is this like great opportunity and a curse at the same time, in that you'd need to understand your work will change in that context. If your work is not doing your job, it is managing others and their work output and their work quality, you become more of a manager than an individual contributor. And is everyone ready for that? And do we have the skills for that? It requires different skills and different evaluative tools for individuals in their daily work. Like if I'm drafting an email, is it the right content before I send it to my boss and get fired? I need to understand that. I can't have an intern do that for me. And if someone goes to get my lunch, is it gluten-free? Is it going to kill me? Like, is it going to give me problems in that? Like, all these things you'd have to learn the skills to evaluate and figure out. So it's an incredible opportunity, but also very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, if you write a blog post about a specific topic and you give enough input, you get 3 interns to write 3 different versions, and then you pick the right version and edit it and then post it, and you probably have a better result in less time spent by yourself on it, right? But the process is important, and how you steer the process and how you monitor it and how you QC what's coming out of it, of course, is critical too. Maybe a good connection to the next slide of number 49 here, where it says, do you have that use case? Which is essentially, do you have the use case for those infinite interns, right?
Yeah, and I love this slide just simply because of the image. I want to include it. But let's
describe it for our audio listeners.
There's a gentleman in he's got his jacket off, so he's clearly getting down to work, and he's wearing a vest and a tie and a long sleeve shirt, and he's standing in front of an Apple IIe, I think it is, with a black and white screen, holding a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk with a disk drive beside him. So it's modern technology at the time, which is very much most modern kids won't even know what the heck this thing is. But you would put the disk into that big drive on the left. That's how you'd load information into the computer. You'd store it on disks, and you'd have hundreds of those little floppy disks. You'd load it in, and it very slowly transferred that data from the device on the left into working memory or disk on the computer, because it was very expensive at the time. Now it's all in the cloud. It's a very different context. But this idea that VisiCalc, this visual calculator, took 20 hours of work and turned it into 15 minutes, because you used to do all this by hand. Computers back in the day were human beings that did the math. They computed the answer. And this was the step change shift, in that instead of having a computer that was named Mary or Jim, you had a computer that calculated information for you. And so, a lawyer seeing this and saying, that's neat, that's a neat trick, but I don't want to save 19 3/4 hours. That just doesn't happen. I don't think I see that same use case in generative AI right now. Like, sure, you can write an email faster. There's not that huge dramatic step change that I see. How about you, Peter?
Yeah, so I think it's very, very use case or task specifically different. Like we saw in our episode last week, we went through an exercise of creating an entire marketing plan, essentially, that we both kind of agree on, that with a like a senior level marketing manager and a small team, would probably take something like several days, maybe up to a week, to work out and to optimize. And we went through that process in about an hour and a half with ChatGPT, with I would say a 85 to 90% quality output, right? So something that's really useful, that still needs some tweaking in the end and some optimization, and especially a selection process, because the volume of good output was quite significant. So we needed to pick in the end what is useful and what's not. So in that case, I think we're there. I think we're in the VisiCalc level of efficiency gains, roughly. Maybe not 20 hours to 15 minutes, but 20 hours to 1 hour, possible in that realm. But it does require you, of course, to be able to, again, manage the process and provide inputs that clearly define the context, that clearly define the desired outcomes, that also define the style in which you want the outputs to be fashioned in, etc., etc. With any creative process, it could go off into any direction if you're not clear in what you're looking for. And I think that's what's kind of easily forgotten. While back with VisiCalc, if it was about financial accounting, well, the accounting rules are defined by someone else. I shouldn't be very creative about that, probably, right? So you follow those rules. Once you feed them in, the system follows those rules, right? Like VisiCalc would have done maybe back then, if you create a table that follows those rules. So I think today it's just more complex, because the potential use cases are vast, but how to go from initial desire to input to process to output is still very experimental and unknown. And so I think it's very different for different use cases in terms of how much gain we really see. I think some people see the killer app already and use it, like maybe in customer service applications. I hate to say it, but recently I got a call from one of the major telco companies here. I think everybody knows who I'm talking about, and in Canada. And they seriously called me to give me identifying themselves as a what was it, a business associate representative, whatever, to try to tell me about a new deal that I could join for extended products, and I think a new contractual period for a mobile service. I could not understand a word. I mean, I did understand the rough context, but I could not understand any of the details, what they were saying. Their accent was so heavy that it was just impossible, right? And then they would announce at the beginning that the call was recorded for quality control purposes. And I said, I hope it's recorded, but I don't want it to be recorded from my end, because this is ridiculous. And so, I mean, I'm totally open-minded that everyone can do, should be able to get access to a great job and not have limitations. But, I'm a horses for courses, I guess is the right word. Horses for courses. In this case, I would have probably preferred to be called by an AI and be clearly explained what the deal is about. Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, that's not a job I would want right now, to call up people and try and convince them on a new cell phone plan or deal when they already have one.
Right.
I think everyone would feel like, why can't that be a text message? And obviously I understand all the dynamics of why that happens, but
right.
That's probably not a high on university graduates list or anyone's list about what job they want to do at this point. But yeah,
For sure.
Where to save time and I think those types of jobs where it can be replaced by a computer are the ones that will be replaced. And hopefully the people that were doing that work will get way more interesting opportunities for them. That's one thing.
That's really exactly it. Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah. I mean, what a decision-making process by that company to decide to engage a call center where obviously the caller quality of that agent in that call center is nowhere near of what I would expect if someone's trying to sell me something, right? Like let alone do I want these type of calls at all anymore, right? But just, if you do it right, and not at an unacceptable level of communication quality.
There's a bunch of tests out there, IELTS and things like that, evaluate your English capability. You kind of use standards around that. I wonder if there's an AI that could listen into a conversation and identify how understandable someone is speaking. Like, is my way of speaking understandable for people? What could I do differently? What kind of a voice coach could I get to improve how I speak? I think that'd be an interesting AI to build.
Yeah, for sure. Let's go to the next slide, because it actually talks about use cases that do seem to be in the realm of where it becomes very effective. So let's go through those, Dave. Maybe let's start on your side. What do you think about this slide?
So these are the kind of the obvious hits or the quick wins. As we talked about, customer support, second from the right there. Marketing, you can easily evaluate if you're generating an image. One of the things that AI does frequently is they have trouble with hands when they're generating images. And so if you generate an image for an ad and there's too many fingers, let's say, you can easily see that and you can catch it quickly.
Right.
And so in that, you're generating lots of imagery really quickly, and you can quickly evaluate if it's good or bad. And encoding is another example where there is like a math-like answer. Where it does or it doesn't work. The code does or doesn't compile. It achieves the goal or it does not. And those are kind of easy to work on. And I think it's funny, the customer support example they talk about but use with caution, as the example you were just talking about is quite relevant. I'm curious if you see any other early adopters. Where else do you see AI being used in interesting spaces?
Well, I think early adopters is everything experimental at the moment. I mean, we just talked about Fei Li creating these new 3D worlds. I think in the gaming space we will see massive changes. Of course, anywhere in the entertainment industry, I think there's a lot of rumblings going on in the background. I don't think movies will be made the same way they have been, even with traditional CGI. I think that world will massively change as well. So and then, I mean, anything. I mean, like if I, for instance, a lot of cultural things will change. If I look at cooking resources, like if I look at recipes online right now, I think that's a massive space to be disrupted by AI, because, to be honest, looking up recipes on websites sucks. Like, it's one of the worst experiences you can have. They're filled with irrelevant information, people's personal stories that I don't care about, in most cases. I mean, sometimes maybe there's an interesting background story, but I want that to be optional and not have to work through until I find the recipe. Then there's advertising galore going on that is very disruptive. It's often unrelated and not really helpful to my interest in this case. And the websites have so many blinking ads and buttons and attention grabbers that I really have a hard time finding what do I need to get from the grocery store to make this recipe. So things like that, I think, will be really changing. Last week we talked about or was it the episode before, where we talked about one of the Czech being one of the first companies that are heavily impacted by large language models. That was an educational platform for students that has kind of missed a little bit the development and paying the price for it right now. So I think the experimental side of things, there's an endless number of applications. But there was one venture capitalist that recently said an interesting thing, which is a lot of companies, especially in this early adopter experimental phase, try to apply AI as if it is, adding more flour to a cake that's already baked. So that's very tough to do, right? Like, you bake the cake and you can put some powdered sugar on top and maybe some raspberries and whatever, and make it more, decorated, or add some fruit or whatever it is. But the flour is baked into the cake, and he equated that to AI's an AI technology is having to be part of the core of the recipe of the product, so to speak. When you bake the cake and make the dough, essentially to create the core structure of the product and build it out from there. And I think what he was hinting at is that we will see a whole avalanche of startups that will come out, and even incumbents that will come out with products where the AI is at the core, and then the user experience and the added value is sort of mixed in around that, instead of trying to pluck AI sort of a little bit on top of a cake that's already baked. Does that make sense, Dave?
It does, yeah. We jump to the next slide as we're kind of chatting this through.
Yeah.
Figuring out how to, like, as I was talking about, how to fundamentally change your core work structures.
Right.
You can't really kind of sprinkle that in. Like you can try and prototype or experiment or add that in. But if you're going to go from an experiment to actually executing with that, you have to change your day, like how you organize and set up your day, what you do all day long.
Right.
Whether that's at the company level or at the personal level, is this fundamental change that's coming toward people that I think we're not quite ready for, which is kind of where this is relevant here, where they're talking about all these different categories across the bottom and different sectors and areas, and whether you have daily active users or weekly active users.
Mm-hmm.
It's that management and software are the top, and then it scales down to, legal to me seems like a really interesting opportunity. And it's fascinating, like as case law, to evaluate case law and where it would apply.
Mm-hmm.
There's some hilarious examples of when that's gone wrong out there, where a lawyer presented to a judge a few examples, and a couple of them were what's called hallucinated or made up. They didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
The lawyer was barred, and it was a bad experience. So there's maybe some wrist slapping that's happened in that. But office admin being less than 10% of daily active users is really fascinating to me. Or sales. There's so much opportunity here.
Do you think this behavior is based on the sort of the typical mindset of those types of roles and users, where some are more resistant to change than others?
It could be. It's kind of hard to understand, like in health over sales. I guess, what is your learning paradigm? How do you think about learning and change in your industry?
Right.
And what does disruption look like for you? If you train for 10, 15 years or longer, like a lawyer goes to school for a long time, a doctor goes to school for a long time and learns a way of thinking, how adaptable or malleable are they? Where someone who writes software, new languages show up all the time, and you're applying your core skills to that new language. That's an expectation that we've all got in the software industry. I wonder if that plays into this.
Yeah, I found that in my experience, especially in the health and medical technology industry, is that the attitude of medical professionals is quite often that if I haven't done the research myself, I don't trust it. Mm-hmm. So which scales to organizations across geographic regions, which means, for instance, if you have done the research in, let's say, the USA, and you have proven and yourself through case studies with patients, and you go through the certification process, and let's say the FDA approves the product, right? If you go to France or to the UK or to any other place, Japan is a very good example, because they don't trust any of that. They say we have to do mm-hmm. this all over again for Japan, in Japan, and if you don't do it with us in Japan, we're not going to certify your product. And some of that mistrust is, of course, warranted, because it's a very critical topic, right? You get this wrong, and people potentially die. So so I think that, but that also establishes a mindset which doesn't really necessarily promote experimentation, does it?
Yeah, which is, I think, there's that solidification. You need that to protect people when the decisions are big. You need that to protect people and keep people safe. And where is the safety versus innovation right balance in this?
Right.
This is one of the many things we're still figuring out.
Yeah. Let's go to the next slide. So the future can take a long time.
Yeah. These next three slides kind of pull together. If you look at December 2014 to July 2024, expected in 3 years is the gray line,
right.
where we're at today. The cloud, we all think that kind of the cloud is this big established technology, or at least I do. I've got that thought. Maybe I'm
Right.
biased.
Right.
But it only handles about 30% of the workload. We all assume it's going to be a half, but there's still a lot of servers out there in a lot of different places. It takes time to
Right.
build this out and have ramp it up.
Which means also that opportunities often exist longer than we think, right?
Precisely.
Yeah. Okay, so next slide.
Yeah, this is interesting where CIOs, they have launched something, but half don't have a plan for anything for at least a year. So everyone's dipping their toe in the water, but no one has a real strategy or a plan in this. So I
Right.
think this shows that while we have that data around the cloud of how it takes a long time, this is a clear indication that very few, if any, CIOs know what they're going to do with AI and know how to implement it. Everyone's tinkering and very few are executing.
Yeah, and it goes a little bit back to what we've discussed before, which is toys to play with rather than problems I want to solve, right? Like there's a lot of input coming saying, everybody's using this, you got to get on board and blah blah blah, and it's like, okay, I can try all this. I can use a chatbot for my customer service. I can have people use Copilot to write letters and emails or maybe proposals. But is that a problem that we need to solve right now? Or where are our core challenges and how can this technology align to help me solve those more effectively and more efficiently? So I think that is where, other than dipping the toe in to play with the toys, I think that's where the conversation should start, right?
Agree. Yeah, we're all sprinkling flour on top of stuff right now, as opposed to actually having a business problem and figuring out which tool we can use to solve it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Next slide. We're getting quickly to the end now, but eventually new platforms mean new tools. SaaS enabled a huge expansion in automation, unbundling workflows out of SAP, Excel, and email. There's a lot in here, I think, that we could discuss. Let's see if we can get this to the point. Can you please explain to our audio listeners this slide?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different categories of operations, IT, engineering, product, sales, and marketing across the bottom. And then there's the year. So they're showing the rising trend of the average number of software as a service apps being used in each of these departments in large enterprises. So in 2021, it was about half or a little less for most of these, 2022 more. And by 2023, about 50 to 75% of the organizations were using SaaS tools. So getting out of Excel and email and getting into collaboration tools. This has been a significantly rising trend of 10 to 20% across all industries year over year. There's been a big jump in that as people figure out how to do it. The first time you take an Excel spreadsheet and put it into Google Sheets and then have 2 or 3 people working on it at the same time, someone deletes a whole bunch of your rows and you don't know how to fix that. Like there's this learning cadence to it that people have to figure out that takes some time. And I think you're seeing that happen in SaaS. And I think we're just dabbling into what that looks like in AI tools.
Right. And it's interesting that they bring up SAP. I mean, Oracle is probably in the same box. All those large enterprise scale ERP systems. Is this another one of the go-arounds where those monolithic systems are going to be under threat? Or do you think it's going to be very complementary?
Yeah, it's a great question. All of those monolithic industries, the Oracles of the world, are trying to find their relevance in this space.
Right.
And will Oracle find some way? They launched a small business platform a while back, Oracle did, which I thought was hilarious, and maybe it's great. But I think that finding their relevance in this new space is what should certainly be occupying their time. And will they? Fascinating question. I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, they're all launching new stuff that implements AI, but it seems often a little bit like the flour on top of the cake instead of inside the cake. But we'll see what happens next, of course. So
I agree.
Sorry, go ahead.
IBM in their granite layer is one where I think that they've actually figured it out. And old incumbent international business machines,
Right.
we reviewed their granite tools, which I think is actually a really good indication of a old incumbent dinosaur company hitting the market in the right moment with the right tools.
Making a smart move. Yes, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So AI tends to turn into automatic. As technology matures, it disappears. What does that mean?
Yeah, I guess we think of AI as this magical new tool, but for all of us that have a word underlined in red in our word processor, it's the same thing. It's a pattern recognizing when the word is spelled wrong. We don't think of that as like a cool AI tool that helps us, or Grammarly, or any of those tools. It's just part of the software. We expect it to fix our typos. We expect our keyboard as we type to correct the spelling mistake that we make because we fat fingered it on our phone.
Right.
That's not artificial intelligence. That's just the software.
Mm-hmm.
So as things progress, it's the smart feature, it's automatic, and then it's just an expected capability of the feature of software.
Yeah.
Right now, Apple's just launched a new feature where you can generate an emoji. So these little kind of you can type in a couple of words, and one of the new Apple AI features is that you can invent your own emoji to meet the moment. You can have a duck smoking a cigar, or whatever you want to do, and it'll create that for you,
Right.
Or add it to yourself. When will that just become an expectation that that's what the software does, as opposed to a cool new tool?
Yeah. And it's going to be interesting whether that's going to be a generational thing or whether that's going to happen much faster, where we actually expect it to happen already. I mean, it's to me, this last 2 years have been so fascinating how we were really surprised about the quality of output and the conversational aspect, and basically the Turing test being, arguably overcome by what these models can do. And now we're like already complaining that they're not smarter than Einstein in every aspect of anything in life and the world, right? So I think
they're all too slow.
way too slow and way too expensive. Yeah, it costs a tenth of what a human costs, or maybe 2% of what but it's too expensive. So it reminds me a bit of the discussion. Remember e-commerce coming into, Amazon, of course, and being disputed whether Amazon is viable, and with all these billions invested, can they ever return the money? And Jeff Bezos, obviously, kudos to him. You can be critical of some of his approaches on what it's changed in the world, but he did have that vision of saying, we're going to see this through, we're going to keep investing, we're going to keep our investors on board and motivated to see this through with us over a long period of time, and eventually see the returns. And of course, now we're looking at, of course, the world's dominating retailer, or one of them at least. And the discussion was always within the web development circles. It's like e-commerce, it's its own thing, right? And some visionaries said, well, e-commerce will just be commerce at some point. It will just be business, like electronic business or brick and mortar business. It's all business in the end. There will be a time where it's no discussion anymore what it is. And more clients that I talk to now, they have both channels as their retail outlets, but they're not talking about them as if they're two different businesses. And I think this is what this slide is also pointing towards, right? Like, it's like AI magic, and then now it's super smart, and it's smart enough to be acceptable, and now it becomes automatic and agentic, and eventually it's a tool that is sort of within the fabric of all the processes and activities. That's probably what this slide is pointing towards, right?
Yeah, like there may be a time in our future where when you go to book a holiday or a trip, you just say, I want to go to Miami on this date. And it figures out your flights and figures out your hotels, and it knows your settings and parameters. That will be magic the first time it happens. It'll blow your mind. But when you called up a travel agent and had them do that 50 years ago, and they said, I want to go here and have this, and they knew where you wanted to stay and made sure you had a taxi to get there, or a bus, or rented a car. They took care of all those details for you because they understood it.
Right.
At some point in our future, AI will take care of that for us, and it'll be magic for a while, and then it'll just be an expectation for us that's of course it does all that stuff. It'll just be part of the software.
Why wouldn't it? Okay. And with that, we come to the last slide for today. We've been overtiming here like crazy, but I think it's a really interesting presentation that kind of brings a lot of these developments to a point. So when automation works, it disappears. For instance, Otis launched the Autotronic automatic elevator in 1950. Interesting comparison, isn't it?
Yeah, it's sort of like the idea that you walk up to an elevator and someone has to drive it. This used to be how it worked, is that the doors of the elevator and what floor it went up to. In one of
Right.
my old office buildings, we had a cargo elevator that was in the back that you had to drive still, like you had to operate the elevator. And if you got it more than, I think it was 12 inches too high, the whole elevator shut down and you broke it. So there's a skill to actually operate the elevator. And so Otis in 1950 released this Autotronic, which is a great 50s name in Jetson's era.
Yeah.
But you can see in this curve that it wasn't 1951 where all the elevator operators stopped being in existence. Like
Right.
it didn't immediately stop, because elevators in buildings and enterprises isn't something you replace every day. So you didn't just immediately swap out all your elevators. There was a period of time where, as new buildings were created, as renovations happened, as automation happened to these buildings, they eventually swapped these things out. But this pace of change, I think, will happen much faster now, just how things are occurring. But as you say, you can't put flour back into the cake. A business that operates in a certain way today may be disrupted by a different business, but Amazon can't just immediately sprinkle in the AI to make that magic in their business. They need to figure out how to revolutionize themselves and be different and innovate around this.
Right. And it's interesting to look at this curve here, which basically looks at the number of elevator attendants in the USA. So this is just
Mm-hmm.
for the USA from 1900 to 1990. And it starts at about 10,000 or maybe 12,000 elevator attendants in 1990, and then goes up to 1950 with maybe 95,000 elevator attendants, totally being, professionally active, I guess. And then it drops down from 1950 to 1990, and it's interesting to think that even in 1990 there was like something like 12,000 elevator attendants still active at that time. I remember maybe one time being in an elevator way back as a kid where there was an operator of the elevator. But in 1990, in the USA, there was still somewhere between 12 and 15,000 professional elevator attendees active. So they, in some cases, it might have been for the nostalgia maybe, or for the aura that and the energy it brings to a certain place, maybe to a high-end boutique hotel or whatever it may be. But what do you think about this? And also, I wonder, did you have to trust these elevator attendees for your safety, or do you think along this development curve from 1900 to 1990 there was mechanisms in place that even if the elevator attendee made a mistake, you wouldn't lose your life?
Yeah, I'd be curious, like your general, like getting caught in the door is one thing as they're opening and closing it, but like uh, driving an elevator in the context, there's slippages, there's ways that it can be dangerous.
Right.
And if you there was sort of a throttle on a lot of these old elevators where the faster you pushed it up, the faster the elevator went. And if it overheated, the wheels on the metal cables could actually overheat and slip. So if someone was too exuberant in their elevator driving, just like a race car, you could go off the tracks. So there was a little bit of, if you were in a hurry, you could ask the elevator operator to drive faster, if it made sense to go up and down. There could
And
be an
then
element of danger
good
in
luck
that.
for the next guy that jumps into that elevator, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting analogy, and certainly we will see a similar thing where a lot of businesses will continue to drive their processes old school way and be able to do that. Again, back to my example of Germany having relied for too long on the automotive and mechanical engineering industries, not having innovated. Yes, they brought in digital innovations, but more as a user of the technology than as a really inventor and driver and manufacturer of that industry. And now they're paying the price, and I think it's going to be a very painful, hopefully just a few years before the country understands that protesting that the world's changing is maybe not gonna solve the problem. I understand the concerns. People need to put bread on the table and keep a roof over their heads, and they have a right to voice their concerns. I think, especially when corporations have been so short-sighted that they put out massive dividends a year before they announced that they're in free fall. So for sure that is a valid criticism, and I stand behind that. But in the same time, from a country's governance perspective, you haven't really put laurels on yourself if you do that, and this will be the same for companies and organizations that adopt this technology to move forward, and some of them try to push it out as long as possible to avoid it, and may or may not see the consequences. Dave, how do you look at this presentation, and how does it influence, let's say, the next 12 months and how you work personally, but also who you work with and what you try to accomplish for them?
Yeah, I really like kind of looking back in history and evaluating what trends we can see and trying to imagine where we're going to go. 2025 is going to be a really fascinating year of organizations that are actively in the game of trying to run prototypes, grapple with this problem, are probably the most interesting to me. If you're waiting on the sidelines and not yet ready to evaluate AI and how it could fit into your business, it's going to be too late very quickly. Because I think what we all need to figure out is, what is the right GUI, what is the right interaction, what is the right way to layer this into our business and into our lives. And the only way to do that is to grapple with it, to figure it out, to experiment, to try it, essentially. And if you're not willing to try it, I just don't think that you're going to be relevant in a couple of years, and you're going to be at risk. So I think the organizations that I'm looking to work with are the ones that are willing to get in there and get messy and figure this out, and dedicate the right amount of energy. You don't have to throw everything into AI and spend all your time there. Is it an hour a week? Is it 5 hours a week? Do you run an experiment with a limited scope and focus? Figuring out how to get that innovation into your organization, I think, is what's really interesting to me. How about you, Peter?
Same here. I see now people I talk to being very open-minded, being willing to experiment and make a moderate investment in that technology or in a changed process or other things. And I also have worked with people lately that just cannot see it and cannot or don't want to bother, I guess, to really take that effort because they believe that they're experts in their fields. Nothing is going to change that, and so on. And I'm orienting myself more towards people that are open-minded to it, that want to run through experiments, but also that are not just like looking at what's flashy and how can we slap the AI label onto our organization, rather than what is a structured experiment and what are real problems we can solve to make a gain for ourselves, not just what other people claim to be good gains. And I think that's the interest. That's where the rubber hits the road, and that's where results come for those people and organizations. And I've seen some early successes already in that, and I'm looking forward to more. Dave, it's been fantastic to go through episode 5 with you today. Thank you very much for spending the time. We've gone over time. I hope everybody's going to stay on to the end with us this time. But I think this, this presentation you brought up is really summarizing a lot of the thoughts and focusing the lens on what matters and where things might be going. And it raises a whole lot of questions we need to keep on the radar to chip away at answering them as an industry and as individuals, helping our clients working with these technologies and innovating their businesses accordingly. Thanks very much for everybody stay on for an hour and a half today. Please subscribe and like if you made it through to the end. And of course, we'll see you next week for another one. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Peter. Have a great day. See ya.
Thank you.